Hey everybody. This morning's topic is metric and SAE or English bolts and fasteners and wrenches. If you're working on a GM car from the 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even a little later, what wrench should you grab out of your toolbox when you want to dig in here? This Camaro is a pretty good case in point, but let me back up a little bit, because it gets kind of confusing trying to understand what wrenches you ought to use and what you would expect. So if you go back far enough, you go back to about 1973, the federal government in the United States made a policy statement that the country was going to switch from conventional so-called English measurements to all international standard metric measurements. And major corporations all began to make that transition, and General Motors was one of those. And so they pretty early stated, hey, we're going to make that transition, and things are coming. Well, in the auto industry, it takes a few years for things to happen. You can't just flip that switch overnight. And so there might have been some earlier ones, but I think the first General Motors platform that really went full metric was about 1978. The mid-size cars, the Cutlasses, the Regals, the mid-size platform got downsized, and so they were one of the first ones that went full across. And that meant everything that could be on the car was metric. But what that really meant, there were some rules, and I was working as a supplier in those days, supplier to General Motors, and the rules pretty much were, if you had a legacy part, a part that's existed for a long period of time, small block Chevy engine in this car, right? If you have a part that's established and it's dimensioned and everything operates in metric or in English units, then you can continue to do that. And so the trick was, you could continue to use English fasteners in your part, but what attached to the car had to be in metric, so that the assembly worker in the plant was using a metric tool to install your part. Now, there may be some exceptions. I've seen some exceptions. In a typical assembly plant, you've got a body shop, you've got a paint shop, you've got some sub-assembly areas. One of the sub-assembly areas, and again this is kind of a big one, is powertrain, is the engine line or the engine dress line. And typically an engine comes into the plant partially dressed because it doesn't know all of the engine plant doesn't know all of the options that an engine might get assembled with. And so an engine with a particular RPO, this one's LB9, comes in, but they don't know whether that LB9 is going to have air conditioning on it. Is it not going to have air conditioning? Is it going to have some special component? And so sometimes, if you got a high enough volume, sometimes a single RPO will be adapted to different applications that way. But in many cases, the engine will come in the plant as an LB9 under a single part number, and then it'll get customized when you do the engine dress. And in principle, I think the engine dress ought to be under the same rules where you would use a metric wrench on it. But I've seen exceptions. This car is an example where the bell housing bolts are certainly still 9/16ths, and you would make that marriage of transmission to engine on that engine line, on that dress line. So I would say there are probably some exceptions there. But when you get to the main line where you're assembling things into the car, that was pretty hard. That was like, you're going to make sure that's metric. And we did that with a bunch of different ways. When I worked on brakes and brake boosters, we had studs that were splined, kind of splined like a lug bolt stud in a brake drum, and they were pressed in. And so if I had a brake booster that was going into a 1978 Cutlass, it had press-in studs that were metric threaded, that were coated blue so that you knew that they were metric. If I was sending that same part into a Chevrolet truck plant in those years, it would have a conventional phosphate-coated bolt stud that was splined and would go in, and it was a conventional English thread. So that was kind of the rule. When you got into these cars, into the interiors, then certainly everything would transition to metric pretty quickly when the program switched. You generally wouldn't, I would say it seems as though that they tried to do major switches when platforms made a major change. Like the 1980 Citation X cars, was a natural spot. GM was going through a downsizing program, and so as programs went through the downsizing, it was a natural time to switch fasteners. And sometimes the platforms just had to pick a point and go. So the clue would be, if you're going through the interior and you encounter a metric fastener, you're probably, it's going to go. Engines stayed in English dimensions until a new engine came out. So the LS, the old Gen 1 small blocks were English dimensioned, and the LS motors, when they came out, were metric. Transmissions, the 204R was among the first, I think, that converted to metric, and they even stamped the pan. It says metric on the bottom of the pan so that people knew when they were working on it what they had. One of the reasons that Torx fasteners were so popular, started to become popular, Torx is a good fastener for a lot of engineering reasons. It's a good fastener that drives well and so forth, but the head is neither English or metric. So you could change the thread and have a Torx head on it and drive a combination of fasteners with a Torx. And that's another one of the solutions. On this engine, what you'll find is, particularly on engines, you have to think about where was the assembly done, because what you'll find in here, now before I get too far, understand what I'm giving you is some general rules, and you'll find exceptions all over, but this is what I've learned over the years and what I had to live under when I was working as an engineer, as a supplier, and working in the company. I'll tell you that, I'll give you another one. I was working on brakes for, I believe the year was 1980, for the step van, or pie wagon as people used to call it. We were doing a four-wheel disc brake package for that. And those four-wheel disc brakes, because it was a new part to that vehicle, all of the pieces, again, the part itself was dimensioned in English units, but all my threads, all my attachments, all my bolts, everything there had to be metric. The biggest shock for that one was we needed a 10 millimeter brake bleeder screw. And I'll say one of my complaints or concerns when we were converting to metric was, in the American English system, there's a multitude of threads and a multitude of parts. The industry was full of, you could get brake bleeder screws in multiple threads and layouts. When we wanted a 10 millimeter bleed screw, we searched the entire world and nobody made one. And so we had to tool one custom from scratch. The company I worked for had, global partners, and nobody in the rest of the world needed a bleed screw that size. But we had a heavy truck, relatively heavy truck, with about 14,000 GVW, and we needed a better flow in that bleeder screw than a standard 8mm screw. So you get some anomalies. And so, I'm sure that in 1980, I don't expect they converted the entire step van over. Maybe they did. I wasn't privy to that. But as you did new product, it had to be metric. That was the rule. So let me take you under hood for a minute. So if I come under hood on the Camaro, we had, you can see on the tuned port system, which was going toward metric, most of the fasteners on that were Torx, which again lets them choose what kind of thread they want to have on the fastener, but the driver is the same either way. You'll find some interesting things on the engine under hood. And again, if you're working on these things, you kind of want to think about who's installing the part. Because the engine, many things were 3/8/24 threaded bolts and a 9/16 inch wrench. But in the plants where you're doing air conditioning, see there's the air conditioning bracket, or this brace. Now that's interesting that brace is a 9/16 yet. Yet this one is a 15mm, which would tend to indicate that the engine plant or engine dress line put that brace and bracket on, and somewhere else in the assembly plant process a vehicle plant person was putting on that 15mm bolt. The alternator is the same way. Okay, that's a 15mm fastener, but the brackets attaching it to the block are often run with 9/16 inch bolts. And it could be that, again, either the engine plant or sometimes the engine dress line will put those brackets on. It depends. This whole process leads to some interesting oddities. Same thing, if I go to the back of the block, and it's hard to see down in there, but there are ground wires attached to the back of the cylinder head, and they're attached to a stud, and that stud has a 9/16 inch hex on it. But then the nut that attaches over the back is actually 15mm. And in some cases like that, there are a few places on here where you have a 3/8/24 threaded nut that has a 15mm hex on it. Because the rule that most of us had to work with the plants was, when you bring in your part, the plant assembler needs to drive it with a metric socket or a metric driver. Interesting times, and that persisted through the 80s and the 90s. As things converted over, today, and there's probably very little, if anything, that remains in a General Motors car that isn't metric. But in the 80s and 90s especially, you could see quite a bit of variation. Okay, one correction from some things I said earlier. I was pointing to this engine and said 3/8/24 bolts. That wasn't right. They're 3/8/16s. It's the coarse thread version, and the 3/8/24 is the fine thread version. And sorry for creating that confusion. Now, what I was trying to dig into a minute ago was, now one thing that you need to watch out for on these engines and cars is odd fasteners. And I say odd fasteners because metric doesn't tend to have as much variation. you can go into an English thread, and the industry had many, many different versions. So you had a 3/8/16 coarse, you had a 3/8/24 fine, there were even extra fine and probably even ultra fine. And there was a wide variety, and you could go into any machine, industrial supply, and almost buy those off the shelf. Sometimes you'd have to get them custom made, but there was a wide variety. If you went into metric, you basically had a standard coarse thread, and that was all that was there. And so what that drove the engineers to do is create some of their own. And you can run into those, and you need to be careful because you can get tricked. My first one on that was on I believe it was a 2.8 liter Chevy, and the flywheel bolts, the flywheel to crankshaft bolts, were custom. And the custom was that they were a 3/8/24 through a calculator conversion and a round off, that they were very, very close to a 3/8/24. They were a custom metric thread. And I remember the day when I had a very irate machine shop manager, machinist. The guy was a master machinist in our prototype shop, and he came in. I was asking him to make essentially a fixture that looked like the duplicate of a crankshaft flange from a 2.8. And I spec'd the thread that they asked for, or that I needed, because it had to take a standard flywheel, and I was using the standard flywheel bolts. And he came in with the handbooks and the charts and said, "Show me where this thread exists, because it's not in here." He had to go out to a machine tool supply to buy a tab, and they had to custom tool a tab to cut the threads for that. And it was a special order. I think it took me a couple of weeks for them to make a tab for it. And kind of the lesson there was, though, that it would be very tempting if you were working on one of those engines, you could take a 3/8/24 and start threading it in the hole. And you might get a couple turns on it, and you might think you got it. And then, put an impact or something on it, and you'll tear everything up. So you have to really watch, because there were some that today, in the 2000s to 2020 plus, some of those have come in and been added to the list, I'll call it. And I think you'll find there are some metric fine threads that in the 80s you just couldn't find here. But it's just a caution that as you go through working on these things, watch out, because you will have a mixture of threads of different kinds. So if you're working on these cars, I hope that helps. It was quite a learning experience for me as we went through and tried to struggle through making that conversion from the days when everything was English units to going over to metric threads. And I've kind of learned, so I know when I'm working on the Camaro, I know what to look for. And if I was working on a different GM car, I kind of keep the same rules in my head. Is it a legacy part? Is it a new part? Who put it on? Was it something that the assembly plant would assemble? And then that helps me figure out which one I want to grab. And you can just do it by trial and error, I know of it, but some days it's kind of frustrating, because every time you go grab a wrench, it's the wrong one. And I've learned on the Camaro, if I'm grabbing something on the small block, 90% of the time, it's a 9/16 inch wrench. But when I get into the accessories that were installed by the assembly plant, well, then the 15 millimeter comes out. Or 13 millimeter, that was another one that they liked, but often it's 15. And just something to think about as you're working on these older cars. I hope you enjoyed that video. If so, please subscribe to my channel.